Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Today we've got a very special episode for you. We're going to dive deep into the heart of early Christianity through the lens of memory, actually. And so today we're exploring a groundbreaking approach to one of the most pivotal events in Christian history, the resurrection of Jesus, as depicted in 1 Corinthians. So imagine stepping back in time and witnessing the formation of the beliefs that would literally shape Christianity for millennia. How did the early Christians remember and pass down the story of the resurrection? How did their collective memory influence the way that we understand these events today? I've got Dr. David Graieg, author of a fascinating study that brings these questions to light in employing memory theory to peel back layers of history and tradition. We're going to get into what memory theory is, questions surrounding that, and how it all sort of impacts and plays a part in understanding how it actually supports the resurrection. His innovative perspective offers a unique look at the resurrection narratives, challenging our traditional understandings and inviting us to consider the dynamic role of memory in shaping faith. So whether you're a longtime believer, a history buff, or simply curious about how memories form the foundation of collective beliefs, this interview promises to enlighten, challenge, and inspire. Let's get ready to embark on a journey through the past, guided by the latest in biblical scholarship and memory theory. So prepare your questions, open your minds. Let's delve into the memory of the resurrection appearances that are described in 1 Corinthians. But first, a little about my guest. So I've got David Graieg with me. He's a lecturer at Sheridan Institute for Higher Education. I hope all this is still up to date. I pulled it from, I think it was Academia, EDU or something, or maybe it was the Rutledge website where your book was recently published. He's a sessional lecturer at Alpha Crucis. Is that how you say that? Alpha Crucis University College, an adjunct lecturer at East Asia School of Theology, Singapore, and an academic sessional at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. And you're also Australian. Your accent is really cool, and I'm very jealous.
I don't know about cool, but yes, I'm born in Australia.
Well, what do you think about American accents? Are you like they're whatever, or do you think they're nice, or what are your thoughts as an Australian?
Yeah, well, I guess like Australia, they're varied as well. But in general, I really like the American accent. I lived in the US for 3 years in Dallas, and so I had some of the Southern accents, and they were great. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, well, let's just jump right in. So we're talking about memory theory and how your investigations into memory theory as a New Testament scholar have really kind of impacted the way I think, and I think your research into this topic is really going to at least highlight the importance of like taking this seriously, because a lot of skeptics, I mean, even Bart Ehrman have written things on like how, memories are just unreliable and we can't really rely on memory in terms of like, these resurrection appearances that are recorded not only in 1 Corinthians, but in the Gospels and stuff. They're just unreliable because their memory in general is unreliable. So, I suppose a good segue here would just be to ask you, how did you get into this specific topic of study into looking into memories and the resurrection?
Yep. Yeah, basically, it's actually through a friend. So I was looking to do a PhD. I was interested in Jesus' resurrection. And in 2014, I was like 10 years ago, so this is kind of when it started, I knew Dr. Andrew Loke, and he's the one who suggested, why don't I study a memory approach to Jesus' resurrection? So yeah, he really gets the credit for introducing me, suggesting it. I feel like.
Yeah, no, and Andrew, he's a friend of the channel. He's been on several times. We're actually planning another interesting episode with him. I think coming up in April. His recent interaction with Richard Carrier. But anyways, yeah, no, that's interesting that Andrew played such a pivotal role. What was like the most surprising thing that you learned? I know that we've got questions and stuff prepared that we'll get to, but what was as you started to look into this, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about memory theory and how it sort of interacted with the evidence for the resurrection?
Yep. Well, half the study is basically, and the book as well as my time was spent on looking at the biblical text, and half was memory and then seeing how it would apply. And I guess I probably had some findings in each. So one would be in 1 Corinthians. Like when I started, I was fairly unsure what I would find about what scholarship said on the spiritual body. And in some ways, I was kind of worried, like, look, if I just look at memory of Paul, I may end up saying, well, Paul thought it was like a spiritual, immaterial thing. Yeah, but was generally thinking, but the Gospels likely say it's more physical. Yeah, but as I went through, one thing I did find is there's people on all sorts of sides and views of different issues. But in general, I would say the arguments and the scholarship favored that the spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15 should be understood as a not immaterial versus material, but as it's a material body and like empowered by the Spirit. It's like the spiritual realm, which is still, I would say, a concrete, physical, material thing. That'd be one thing. I guess in memory, in some sense, it was all new to me. So I didn't have a background in it. And one of the challenges was then making sure I had a proper understanding and grasp of that. But I guess in general, the reason you're right, like Bardem and others, generally memory is used to say, hey, it's not trustworthy, it's not reliable, can't be said that. And I found that even psychologists on memory and in court cases, they would say, in general, memory is reliable. It's just there's certain circumstances under which it fails. But it's not that blanket case we're saying your memory is unreliable, can't be trusted and stuff like that.
So there are certain cases or certain circumstances or contexts in which memory is unreliable, but in your work, you argue that the type of experience that they would have had would be a sort of candidate for, a good sort of memory impression. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's fair. And I was saying, so even there's like literally being court cases that would say that even though DNA evidence has overturned people's memory of it, they don't think the problem was with people's memories, but with like the questions and how they were phrased that caused contagion. But people's memory, if like carried out in the right way, is trustworthy.
Yeah. Interesting. So the way that the people were asking the questions in court is sort of shaped their response. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So they have said that, or even if it's like the initial police interviews and stuff like that. So there should be proper procedures how you ask questions. I mean, if you want just to apply it to Jesus' resurrection, if you could imagine like one of the gospel authors going up to I'm going to say the eyewitnesses, but that might be to like already assume they're eyewitnesses. But if like Luke is interviewing a Mary or someone, and if he said, what time was it when you got to the tomb, as opposed to was it still dark when you got there, or, how much could you see? Like the phrasing of that already can sort of load or bias or just affect the way that people respond. And so in general, we've got to be asking like a neutral question. And we really don't have insight to, the kind of questions that the gospel authors could have been asking the eyewitnesses. But I guess they're the type of things that could come into effect in our situation.
Well, let's do this. So for people that are sort of coming to this conversation kind of with not a whole lot of background in apologetics or in philosophy or in history, let's sort of set out what the basic scriptural evidence is for the resurrection. And you focus on 1 Corinthians 15. So we should probably lay out what that is and then how that contrasts with what we find in the Gospels, just so people can get a fair understanding, because we're going to be talking about those and referencing them a lot, the source materials. So let's just sort of specify what those are and what they include.
Yep. So when I did start my PhD, I guess most of the times it gets narrowed as you go along. And so I did actually start off as Paul and the Gospels. But yeah, pretty soon into it, I realized it was a bit too much. And so not that I think one's more important than the other, but I guess in general, 1 Corinthians is seen as at least written down earlier than the Gospels. I know recently there's a book by Bernier on the Gospel dates. And in that, he's argued that Mark and Matthew may be in the 40s, in which case that would be before 1 Corinthians, because that's generally dated in the mid-50s. But saying general dates don't place the Gospels in the 40s, but either in the 60s or 70s and stuff like that. So as such, 1 Corinthians is an earlier text, and that's why I looked at that. And in general, 1 Corinthians is a letter to a church that Paul had previously visited. He'd probably previously written an earlier letter to them. Even though it's called 1 Corinthians then, it's probably technically 2 Corinthians as such. And he's dealing with different issues, so he didn't write to sort of correct them specifically and just on Jesus' resurrection, but it's like in part of the issues, he brings this in to help explain some of the issues they're facing, if you like.
And then how does that contrast with what we find in the Gospels? So how do we the actual content? I mean, maybe it'd just be helpful to just read what the creed
Oh, yep,
states
yep.
in 1 Corinthians 15, because I mean I think most people are familiar with the gospel accounts. I mean they've probably read or even heard the gospel accounts, especially if they were Christians growing up. They've been to Sunday school and they go through the Passion narrative, especially around Easter time. So I think most people coming to this conversation will be familiar with what we find there. But then the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, I think, is super important. It may be just helpful to just sort of read it. And if you don't have it pulled up, that's fine. I can pull it up.
Yep, no worries. I do got it up now. But yeah, you're right. So 1 Corinthians 15 is 58 verses, and it's really these 4 or 5 verses, starting from verse 3, that are sort of the creed and has the main part of our interest as well. But yep, so just reading from starting from verse 3, has Paul saying, "For I passed on to you as of first importance what I also received." So it's basically an introduction. So if you like, maybe that's not the best verse break, but so the creed would start midway through verse 3, and it's this: that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. And most people probably say it ends there, although verse 8 is still part of it as such, which says, verse 8 is last of all, as though one born at the wrong time, he also appeared to me, which is Paul.
Yeah, I've always wondered whether or not that last part, it kind of seems like that's something that Paul adds on to the creed, but
yeah,
I
the
suppose
vast
in anything.
majority of scholarship argues that, although I think 2 people, N.T. Wright, of which is one, argues that it could have been part of it.
Interesting. Well, yeah. So that's the creed. And why do we call it a creed? I mean, I've heard people say that the creed itself, because you say like in verse 3, the very beginning of it is like basically just kind of setting up like this is what we received and I'm passing it along, and then it gets into the creed part. But what the creed actually was like an early. Sorry, I'm still. It's very early. Okay, it's 9 a.m. I've got like coffee in my throat and stuff. So, you live in Australia. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier. It's like what 10 p.m. over there right now. So this is like the only time during the day that we could actually make this work. So
I got all artificial lights.
what was I saying? Yeah, this early creed was a sort of saying that was going around in the early church. And some scholars actually date it back, as far as my understanding goes, all the way back to like within 6 months of when the actual resurrection would have happened. And I know that's probably contentious, that dating, but if my memory serves me, talking about memory, even the most skeptical scholars will still date it within a few years of when the events allegedly would have happened. So it's a very important and early source for the resurrection of Jesus.
Yep. Yeah. So on that dating, I would say someone like Dale Allison's recent book on Jesus' resurrection would argue that all we know is it's before Paul visited the Corinthians. So it could be within 20 years. But you're right. In general, most scholars would put it within a decade. And then many scholars put it within a few years or months even. So yeah, I think James Dunn, his Jesus Remembered behind me, yeah, his is within months, he says.
Yeah, I mean, well, either way, it's still, I mean, even 20 years, historically speaking, is a relatively short time, even if, Dale is right there. Well, let's get into memory theory and how that sort of impacts the case for the resurrection. So my first question is, how does memory theory reshape our understanding of the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 compared to traditional historical critical methods?
Yeah, you got you. So just a few things just to point out there first would be that memory theory is not a separate approach on its own. So Thomas Hoover-Kane, he's done his PhD and it got published as The Quest for the Memory of Jesus. And I think he rightly points out that, memory has to be used alongside some kind of exegesis, which I chose to use what could be called either historical criticism or grammatical historical exegesis, but some scholars might use like a postmodern hermeneutic or LGBT lens or something like this. So memories, you still have to, in a sense, read a text, whatever method you use to do that, and memory sort of works alongside that. So it's not just its own thing on its own. And in that regards, then, so yeah, when you say like, how does it compare to the other approaches? I'd assume this is sort of saying the criteria of authenticity approach, which is to say people like Gary Habermas, Mike Kona, and others have used that approach. And in general, I would say just like the criteria approach doesn't dictate sort of the results of how you're going to get that. So William Lane Craig uses it to say that he thinks Jesus probably rose again, but someone like Gerd Ludemann uses the criteria to say it was like a vision. Yeah. So the same with memory then, I think how it's going to reshape the understanding of Jesus' resurrection is going to depend on the scholar who's using it. And by and large, not that many people have yet written on how memory affects Jesus' resurrection, but there's been a few, such as James Frodo has a book called Unreasonable Faith, and in it he does basically say that memory was one of the factors and memory is not reliable, and so it was likely that Jesus was reburied and that people had hallucinations, and the memory sort of transformed that into what we see as this bodily story, but that never really happened. Or someone like Ziva Cook would also, he's got a chapter on this, and he says as well that you can't actually know whether it's got an accurate memory or a inaccurate, unreliable memory. And so since we can't know what it is, we can't really trust the memories of Jesus' resurrection either. Someone like Jen Strodener has not written on Jesus' resurrection, but in general, he said that memory doesn't take you back to the event. It only takes you back to the mind of the author. And so the same thing he would say, you couldn't actually say whether or not Jesus rose. You could just say whether people remembered it, whether or not that happened. But how memory might affect it then. So I guess I've got, as far as I know, the first book length treatment on how memory might impact Jesus' resurrection. And I would argue that memory suggests that the best explanation for why we have those memories is that it goes back to what really happened. And there's reason to think you could say memory is accurate for that period, and that gave rise to the stories we have.
Now let's switch into discussing some of the details. So in your work, you distinguish between individual and collective memory. Can you just make that distinction for us and then explain why it's relevant for your case?
Yep. Yeah, so in the memory scholars, there are people who are known for emphasizing one more than the other. So I'm not saying this is necessarily fair, but someone like Richard Borkham is known for emphasizing individual memory. And then several other scholars, maybe like Chris Keith and Anthony Nadon, for emphasizing social memory, or Alan Kirk. Yeah, and I, in general, would say they should go together. That being said, because that's basically to say that I would say you've got the individual memories in, like, memory doesn't exist just in some sort of collective memory. Rather, you have lots of individuals that make up a group, and then you can have, how does the group remember it, but it's still in an individual. And so I'd say any of the aspects that affect individual memory are ultimately contributing to that social memory of it as well. So I would try to say you should be looking at both. That being said, I guess I probably do spend more time on the individual memory. And so someone's probably going to say I spend too much time on that, miss that. But yeah, anyway, so individual memory is just saying memory is individual. It's someone's individual brain and mind and that. And then the collective memory is saying it's how it's in the social group as a whole, like how does society use it? And an example may be something like you can have your individual memories of, sorry to bring up sad events, but something like September 11th. And then you can also talk about how society uses it. And I guess I'm not American as such, but I'd still say my impression of how the social memory of September 11th is it talks about terrorism, but it talks about hope. It talks about how like we'll stand as a nation and like we won't be overcome and stuff like that.
So what about the dynamic process of remembering and forgetting in the context of the early Christian community? How did that sort of work? And the way that it was written down and the way that it was collected, how did that interact?
Yeah, just to clarify, by dynamic, you're sort of referring to, say, the constructive aspects of memory, is it?
Yes.
Yep. Sorry, I guess there's different ways you can describe it, just clarifying. But yeah, so by and large, I would say that scholars on memory, of which I'm not one as such, right? So I'm talking here about psychologists and philosophers. yeah, and I'm going to then use their findings and try to see what the implications are for the biblical text. But yeah, I would say they would have different perspectives on the extent to which memory is constructive. And in general, they've said that for semantic memories, like memory for facts or lists or knowledge items, that is generally more passive. And so if you take something like 1 Corinthians 15, there's been a creed or tradition, you can basically use that as synonyms there. Basically, then that would be a semantic memory, and so wouldn't be particularly constructive. It'd be passive, and that's to say it likely got passed on as it was. That being said, I'm trying to consider like implications and be skeptical at times. And so I'd say there is still some ways that it could come into play, one of which is that Paul normally refers to Peter by the name Cephas. And so in the creed or the tradition, you have that he appeared to Cephas. And so you could debate and say, well, is that actually what was passed on? Or is that just the constructive nature of Paul's memory coming into play? Like whenever someone said Peter, he remembers that as Cephas. And so I would say, yeah, that is a possible working of the constructive nature of memory, which is to say, I'm not saying this is the case, but I'm just saying theoretically, we maybe can't know whether the creed originally or prior to Paul's receiving it, whether it had the name Peter there or Cephas. But I would want to say in either case, it's not saying it's not debating that Jesus appeared or things like that. It's just a matter of to whom he appeared. Yeah.
Yeah, let's I want to skip ahead in the questions here. I want to ask you about the psychological aspects of memory, like cognitive dissonance and the need for coherence. How do these play they play a role in your analysis, but how do these aspects help explain the early Christians' response to the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus?
Yeah. So I'd want to point at them. So my book isn't a apologetics book as such. Rather, it attempts to be a New Testament studies book, and it would have implications for apologetics. So as such, I don't directly take on the cognitive dissonance theories. I know someone like David Anoon or Chris Kolmanitsky, like they advocate that you can just say that Jesus' resurrection was how did the disciples deal with the fact that they thought their leader was the Messiah and he died, so how would they do that? And because of cognitive dissonance, then they put that together as a resurrection. And I mean, I personally think that's unlikely, but yes, it's not something that's dealt with in my book. And I know people like Regenbaum has a article just called "Did Cognitive Dissonance Cause the Resurrection Appearances?" Or someone like Andrew Loke again, yeah, he deals with that theory. But I would want to say, like, not that I touched this in the book, but I'd basically say that cognitive dissonance, yeah, I don't think it would explain. And even if you add just memory to that and trying to distort it, it wouldn't explain like Jesus' resurrection. Rather, cognitive dissonance, I think, does come into play in the Gospels. And it's how did the disciples make sense of the fact that Jesus, in their understanding, was the Messiah, and yet he was also predicting that he was going to suffer and die, and they couldn't make sense of that. And then actually what helped them make sense of it, I would say, was that Christ appeared to them, and then they could see the picture of this, that he was actually, as the scriptures had foretold, the Messiah, but he was going to be a suffering Messiah and servant, and that was part of that. But yeah, I don't think from reading the scriptures or things like that they just sort of dreamt up a resurrection, but rather it's from encountering that they came to believe in a resurrection, and that would help them make sense of some of these things they weren't expecting the Messiah to be and who Jesus was.
I wonder if you would be okay if we kind of switched gears a little bit and discuss the paper that you sent me. The paper, I can't remember the name of the paper, but it's basically you look at the alternative accounts or the sort of rival, like naturalistic hypotheses that rival the resurrection, and then you argue through using memory theory that and other considerations that those hypotheses are just not as plausible. So I wonder if you'd be okay if we kind of changed gears and talked about those rival theories, and then how your work in memory theory actually helps us sort of rule those out. Does that sound good?
Yes. Yep. That's great.
So let's start with laying out for us what are the sort of major competing hypotheses, naturalistic hypotheses, that are being forwarded by skeptical scholars right now.
Yeah, got you. Yeah. So just the background behind this paper is was originally, and actually this was part from the 2014 days with my discussions with Andrew Logue, was basically trying to say, hey, look, how would memory affect Jesus' resurrection? And he has papers on all the different logical possible options. And so I was building off that. And basically, because my PhD was not a work in apologetics as such, but New Testament studies, I had done the exegesis to say that I think Paul says that Jesus' resurrection is a bodily event. And so I looked at what memory means for that. But basically, some people may disagree with me and say, look, you've done eisegesis, you've misunderstood 1 Corinthians. It's not talking about a bodily event. It's talking about hallucination, or it's the product of lies or something like that. And so basically my contribution was what memory has to say for this, because there's already been lots of excellent scholars who have studied 1 Corinthians and other texts. Yep. And so I thought it'd be good to consider, what does memory impact for the option that they lied, or the option that they just hallucinated Jesus, or that they had misidentified Jesus and it was really not him who was risen, but some other person like his twin or something, or he just swooned and, reawoken. So it wasn't a true resurrection, but just a resuscitation or something like that. And so that's what that chapter was. And then so I've basically finished and touched up a bit, and I've submitted it to a journal for publication. Whether or not it gets accepted, I don't know, but hopefully it will eventually there. But I guess the main alternatives then is, I would say there are lots of scholars, so the views are going to vary. In general, I would probably say the main alternative, though, is the hallucination hypothesis. But they're, depending on who you look at, some are going to say cognitive dissonance, some are going to say that it's not a hallucination at all, it's just sort of an inner illumination. I think it's Crossan who takes that approach, who basically says that it's through sort of realizing like things like the Lord's Supper, it's not that Jesus is really present, but we remember him being that way. And they'd say that's just all it is, expressed interestingly in like resurrection narratives. But yeah.
So in the paper, I'm just kind of looking at the way that you've outlined the different hypotheses. The no experience hypothesis, how does memory theory play a part in ruling that one out?
Yeah, so I guess I should point out, with a memory approach, it can be used in different ways. This is to say, you could use a memory approach to say, given that we have these particular memories, what is the best explanation of those memories? Yep. Or we could basically assume that this is true, like assume it was a lie, and then just ask, how well do people remember that? How would that can sort of compare then to what we have found in the gospel accounts? Would the kind of memory errors that can arise, it's over 20 years or however long the period is, would that sort of crop up, and do we see that there? So you can use sort of a memory approach in different ways. And if you just used a social memory approach, you really wouldn't be looking so much at that, but you would sort of say, how does society remember it regardless of what sort of happened? What is it sort of meaning to them? What are they saying about it as well? So there's a few sort of factors there, but in terms of the no experience one, it's basically saying that if we assume then that nothing actually happened, the disciples didn't see a risen Jesus, they didn't hallucinate or something like that. So this is to say then that they fabricated or lied or made it up. And then we ask basically, are there any studies on how well people remember their lies and fabrications? And there are. And in general, I would say they don't fare well. In general, you find that it's pretty hard for people to remember their story exactly. And so we would expect them to have a lot more inconsistencies and variances and stuff like that. And admittedly, there's some degree of subjectivity there, which is to say some scholars would say, yeah, exactly. That's what we see, right? You see like, what has it still like? Is it still dark? Who women and stuff like this? Although I would still argue that in general, the studies would probably expect it to be not just in these peripheral details, but in the core. So the fact that we still have a strong core of what happened in Jesus' resurrection suggests that the no experience hypothesis isn't the likely explanation. It's memory, and the whole unreliability of it would actually wreak havoc to this sort of view, rather than a bodily resurrection view, which would have like a flashbulb like memory. It'd be a really significant thing. Something like September 11th, you can remember well like that. But yeah, if it's just your made up lie about something, it's not likely to be something that was deep and embedded and that you're able to recall well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was about to summarize what you just said, but I think that you put it across really well. So I don't think we need to go much deeper into that. So I want to turn now to hallucinations. This is, I mean, in the stuff that I've seen as well, this is one of the most popular explanations of the biblical data, not just in 1 Corinthians, but also in the Gospels. So subjective experiences, hallucinations. How does your work in memory help to rule this one out?
Yep. So yeah, once again, this is going to be in that journal article, not in the book as such.
Right.
Yeah, and so basically, it'd be a little bit hard to say here, but there'd be different views. And I mean, firstly, you might want to say, are there other issues with the theory that might be one to take into account? For instance, the hallucination hypothesis does not deal with what happened to the body. And so unless you also amend something to that, it's pretty unlikely, even if they had hallucinations, that they would have continued believing it had they then encountered like Jesus' body when the women actually got to the tomb, or when they found it, or that. So you've got to have some explanation for that. But putting that sort of thing aside, you basically just say, yeah, the body's accounted for, they had hallucinations. Like, what will we make of that? And so in general, you'd say hallucinations aren't that all uncommon, such that unlike a bodily resurrection, which, if it happened, should be, pretty lasting and significant, and that hallucinations can be more common. And you arguably do see, if you're then reading the gospel accounts, what you might call a few hallucinations, which I do think you should technically distinguish from a vision, although in popular terminology they're put the same. And so seeing as I brought that up, so a vision, I think, in this context should be understood as like the Old Testament prophets. So like Isaiah saw the Lord high and exalted. He didn't hallucinate that, at least if you understand it that way. He's claiming he actually had a vision of the Lord high and exalted. Yeah. And so similarly with these visions, maybe something like Jesus going up the mountain. Yeah, you're going to say, like, is that hallucination? Is that a vision? Or Peter had a trance in Acts chapter 10, I think, of a sheet coming down and seeing animals and stuff like that. And then there's also times when, say, Peter was in jail and he sees like angels set him free and stuff like that. And so you might want to say that to some degree, you could argue that the disciples and this did have a few hallucinations, in which case, if someone is hallucination prone, it would suggest then that they're not going to have the greatest memory of their hallucinations. But yeah, and I guess if you consider the social aspect of that, then it's really unlikely, and as in like really unlikely, that people are going to remember their hallucinations the same way, which is to say that Matthew, Mark, or Paul, or the expressions of that just would be very different. So you're then going to have to say that there's some way that, like, over time the stories became familiar. Maybe they copied each other, and this could be called the social contagion of memory and things like that. And so there could be a few factors that come into play, but in general, I'd want to say that, yeah, people probably don't remember hallucinations that well. They're not known for becoming like life-shaping, transforming events, whereas in the Creed, just before that, Paul says that this was of first importance. This was like central to Christianity. And, without it, he believes in verse 20 that your faith is like in vain and worthless and things like this. And that doesn't fit sort of the way they would be describing a hallucination, how that affect them and things like that.
I wonder, something you said made me think of something that we talked about earlier in the stream, where we were, in a court case, someone can ask a question that will then actually cause them to remember something incorrectly because of the way that the question was phrased. I don't remember the name for that, but I wonder if, when it comes to hallucinations, suppose that these individuals had their own individual hallucinations, and then through, talking with each other, like you said, I think social contagion, talking with each other, asking each other questions about their own experiences, that could have shaped their experiences and made them start to sort of meld together. Is that a possible explanation that a skeptic might use?
Yeah, so I'm not in that sense aware of anyone, I guess, because partly this is new. But saying James Frodor's Unreasonable Faith does say that memory is a factor of this, and he thinks that grow. And so, yes, I'd basically say that's probably the type of case you're going to have to argue for. And there'd be various factors you would have to weigh in. So, like, he considers simplicity one of the relevant factors. And in that sense, this is a less simple theory then, because it's got to add multiple things in. And I'd say unless you get into the specifics of this,
You mean the hallucination hypothesis is less simple?
yeah, if you're going to say it requires hallucinations and it requires like a social contagion of memory that sort of brings these together and stuff like that, it's like it's piling up several different, basically minor theories to make the overall theory plausible in some manner.
And so that would then make it less plausible overall.
Yeah, but I mean, that's just one factor, and that's like all things being equal. And they might say, well, not all things are equal because hallucination is a naturalistic hypothesis. And in general, a lot of scholars tend to favor them, and they'd say the resurrection is a supernatural hypothesis, and that may not even, in their minds, be a live historical option.
That is actually where I was going next. So let's talk about that. If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to discuss. I mean, that is sort of the thing that's going on, I think, in the back of everyone's mind. It's just like that is pretty in conflict with my experience of the world. Like, I've never personally seen someone resurrect from the dead. I've heard stories about it. I've heard even contemporary stories of people like in Africa rising from the dead, but I've never seen it myself, and I don't typically like experience or see miracles happening. So my experience of the world seems to be in conflict with this idea of miracles in general. And so it seems like a lot of skeptics reason this way. My experience conflicts with that. And so therefore, these other naturalistic hypotheses automatically are going to be more plausible. How do you think about that sort of view?
Yeah, I agree with you. And actually, I tend to think that is the more common reasoning that I encounter as well with people. Yeah, and so as such, I guess there are probably different ways that people may go about this. So I think some people might say, look, the force of the historical evidence really does suggest it is the best explanation that Jesus rose. Though I would tend to agree with someone like William Lane Craig, and my understanding of what's probably known as the classical apologetics model is that saying like, no, you should sort of first build a case for there being a God who exists, and then suggesting that there's evidence that that God has acted in history. And as such, the resurrection is used not to show that God exists, but to show that, which God has acted in history and revealed himself. So yeah, I'd want to step back and say, consider things like the arguments of natural theology, whether it's, cosmological, theological, moral arguments and things. To see whether or not a theistic or atheistic worldview sort of begins like that. There is a recent book that basically makes this exact argument and says that New Testament studies is it's something called like the metaphysics of the quest for Jesus. And it argues that there's an presumption of sort of secularism and atheism in the quest for Jesus, and that scholars really need to be discussing this, and that it really affects the outcomes. And I basically agree with that. But yeah, and I do think you can make case for miracles. I just see behind me, I've got Craig Keener's volume on miracles there, and like that would be one that would look into this, both the philosophical arguments like for and against miracles, and would have specific cases of miracles. And I think, you'd want to step back and look at that. And then if you can establish that at least miracles are a possibility, that God exists, then Jesus' resurrection and the option that God raised Jesus from the dead would become a live option. And I think you would see that it has greater explanatory power than the other options like hallucination or lie or swoon and stuff like that.
Yeah, I've had what you're talking about reminds me that I've had a guy on the channel, Caleb Jackson, where he laid out 5 different contemporary miracle accounts, and we discussed those fairly contemporary. I think one of them was from the 16th century, where a guy lost his leg and his leg actually grew back. Super interesting case. But there are as you mentioned, thousands. Craig Keener's work, I don't remember the exact number that he cites in there, but there are thousands, literally millions of miracle accounts and that people have made and claim. And I think it's a little bit too quick. Skeptics are a little bit too quick when they argue that miracles just don't happen. I think that they really haven't done their work. I mean, they really do need to investigate these miracle accounts. I think at a much deeper degree. You can't just rule them out because they conflict with your own personal experience. I think that's a very bad way of reasoning. But yeah, no. I wanted to as we sort of wrap things up, I wanted to discuss the other two hypotheses that you discuss. Well, apart from the resurrection. You mentioned the mistaken identity hypothesis and then the swoon or escape theory. So let's discuss those two and then share any thoughts that you have on those alternative hypotheses.
Yep, got you. Yep. So if we just sort of went with the mistaken identity hypothesis, again, saying basically sort of assuming it's true. So it must have been something like, Jesus got crucified, they buried him, the body somehow went missing, that's fine. And then either you've got to say that, I think it's Graieg has basically like the evil twin theory. Jesus had the evil twin. Maybe he's the one who broke in, stole the body, and then like appeared and said, hey, it's me, I'm risen. And then he ran back off to wherever he lived, never to be heard of again. Or you can say the mistaken identity is something like from a distance, they saw someone and they, sometimes you confuse people like that. And then they said it must have been him again. But yeah, and in the case of particularly that it's from a distance, that's not going to make a deep memory impression. So this is not likely to be an encounter that would cause a just change in the disciples' life. And I mean, it doesn't match up with the Gospels who say they saw Jesus close and things like that. So I think that's sort of just a weakness. And I'm just saying, it doesn't fit the memories that we have. And you wouldn't expect people to remember that well either. And so it's just,
I think,
based. Yep.
I think you also argued that it wouldn't explain the disciples' willingness to die for their belief.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm just saying it's like a superficial thing and it doesn't fit with them then having this conviction that death is conquered and stuff like that. It's like it's a chance. It's like a minor thing. But and we do see like even someone like Thomas is like not convinced by others claiming, and they're not just like others, it's people who he's like been with for like the last 3 years and they've all given up to sort of follow, and he won't sort of believe them. And so, what's then to think that they would be willing to like, go on to die and stuff like that. And that's the same thing, I guess, to say in terms of memory, it's unlikely then that, because it's meant to include Jesus' mother and his brothers and people who have lived with him for years, that they would just misidentify, like even a twin. My dad's actually identical twin. And I'm just not likely going to confuse my dad and his twin brother. That I have had friends who have caught up and they're like, there's like, there's something different and like that. But yeah, just to say that these sort of people would, it's unlikely. That being said, you could talk about a few misidentification things. I do think there's some factors that could come into play. So like in Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus, it talks about how Jesus came alongside the two people and discussing this and they didn't recognize him. And I mean, it is possible to say that that was a supernatural sort of blindness. Yep. But it is possible, just basically what we know on memory, to say that you don't expect to see someone who's died again. And that also if someone's sort of in a different clothing, it's just like maybe if you've got a colleague from work or something like that, and then you see them casually just around the town, then you may not immediately identify them and that. And then what we see then is the disciples on the road to Emmaus, then they identified Jesus over the breaking of bread, which was say something that Jesus did in his lifetime and they might be familiar. And you may call that a memory cue. And then that sort of gave rise to the realization of who it was and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think another thing about the mistaken identity theory, especially like the twin theory, I think what makes that super implausible is kind of what you mentioned, like you would notice differences between the two people, and you don't have to be like the son of someone who has an identical brother. I think that you could just be acquaintances and be able to recognize those differences. So I think what would have to occur is that Jesus and his brother would have to be like conspirating the entire time. Like, hey, I did this today. You need to know that this happened. You need to, so it would basically not just be that Jesus had an evil brother. They'd both have to be evil. They'd both try to be tricking everyone. Kind of like in The Prestige. Did you ever see that movie?
Yeah, yeah. Yep, I've seen that one.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. That one involves. There's a lot of like weird things that happen. It's like a magician type show, but the way that it's explained at the end is that there's twin brothers that are basically the reason why they can do what they do. These magicians. So I think that something like that would have to happen where they're conspiring the entire time. Right. And then even in the movie, I think the wife didn't even know, but she could tell that there was like basically almost like a split personality. Like one of them would be, when she was with one of them, it would be great and happy and he was very caring. And then when she was with the other one, the other twin, he was angry a lot more often and stuff. So I think that those sort of personality differences would come through and shine through. And so I think to sort of stave that off, they would have to be conspiring in order to make this happen. So it wouldn't just be that he had an evil twin. They'd both have to be evil. I think that would be, and then that is super implausible given what we've seen in the Gospels and in the epistles.
Yep.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you also mentioned the swoon theory, which I didn't touch on. But yeah, I guess I would say that in general then, like if we just assume that, Jesus didn't die, he revived in the tomb, something like that. Yeah, so I think this would create like a flashbulb memory as well. Like the disciples would be amazed that he's still alive. So just seeing that would be able to create, like they can probably remember decades from then what it was like when they first saw Jesus. But I guess I'd want to say you've then got to say, well, what happened to Jesus after that? Because unless you then attach that he supernaturally sort of was exalted and ascended to heaven, presumably he would have died, like even if it's decades later. And so it wouldn't explain like their beliefs about Jesus and how they came to view it. And I also want to say then the emphasis wouldn't really be on Jesus' resurrection because he would have survived, but in like a nearly dead state. And so, you're not going to say that, death, the enemy has been defeated, that Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits. And this is the promise of the kind of spiritual, as in supernatural, like a glorious body that you will receive. So, it sort of doesn't fit the text. And the flashbulb memory would be of the fact that his crucifixion died. It's not sort of in reflect to his like resurrection body and stuff like that.
I wonder, I don't think that you addressed this hypothesis in the comments, but like I've seen it sort of offered as a joke, but like could aliens explain the resurrection of Jesus, at least the data that we have? Is that a possible theory that you think is even worth addressing or what?
Yeah. So in general, I can't remember if I do touch that even in a footnote, but probably not. And in general, I would say that yes, that is a naturalistic hypothesis, but if you're kind of willing to go to those lengths, I mean, unless you're someone who really feels like you've got personal experience of aliens, it's like pretty far-fetched, such that it'd be more likely suggesting that you've got a bias of like a supernatural agent acting and that you're willing to resort to that rather than that. And I think that was going to be the kind of worldview question that, what's your reason for really thinking aliens and stuff like that? But unless we've got really strong evidence or like some reason to think that, it's really not a likely option. It's just sort of ad hoc, and you could just throw that in to a whole bunch of things and say, well, it was just aliens. And it'd be pretty, unless they can give details of how it works, it's not like a solid, substantial theory. Yeah, and I guess in scholarship, so I said my work is not one in apologetics as such. And so I'm totally sure my supervisors, and I would actually probably think the publisher as well, would have been like, I don't think you should put that in there. It like degrades your work as such. That's not to say these theories don't have a place to be discussed, but yeah, I guess for the type of project I was trying to do, they would actually say that like is lowering the standard of your work.
Well, I'm glad to have played a part in lowering the standard of your work here, discussing this topic on capturing Christianity. No, I was thinking about that. One way I think to sort of rule that out would be a sort of similar critique that you gave earlier, is where with that hypothesis you'd have to add on some more details. Like you'd have to add on that these aliens not only have the capability of coming here and doing these things, but also have the desire to do so, right? And have some motivation to try to fool humans into thinking this. And so there'd have to be built in some sort of reason to deceive people. And I think once you start to build all those things into your hypothesis, that's going to make it less initially plausible. It's going to lower its prior probability. And then, compared to the supernatural, resurrection hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead, it's going to be a lot less plausible, especially if you've got arguments for the existence of God from natural theology. And then also if you take a sort of Swinburnian approach, where he argues that God has, multiple reasons to become incarnate, then in that case, like with God, you actually have some reason to think that God would actually do something like this. Whereas in the alien case, I think the reasoning that you're going to have to come up with is going to be very just sort of disjointed and disconnected from the existence of those beings. So you're going to just have a lot of hypotheses that are sort of joined together that are each going to be implausible relative to each other, and that's going to really lower the prior probability of the overall hypothesis to a degree that is just so implausible that it's not even worth, as you say, it's not even worth taking seriously or even seriously addressing. But I thought it'd be fun to just at least talk about it a little bit, because I've seen it kind of come up as a joke, as every now and then. And I mean, there are skeptics who are like, any natural hypothesis is going to be more plausible than a supernatural one. And so I did kind of want to make that point that it doesn't really follow.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And I liked your logic and reasoning on that. So yeah.
Oh, excellent. Well, we're coming up on time here. Is there anything that you would like to leave with the audience? Did we get enough into the study of memory theory and how that impacts the case for the resurrection? Is there anything that we didn't really touch on that we should before we close out?
Yep. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess that's good because there's a lot to memory theory. So going back to Thomas Hoovercane's book again, so The Quest for the Memory of Jesus, he would actually argue that there isn't just one memory approach as such. Rather, there are memory approaches, and yes, there's sort of a family, but sort of each person has to lay out their way of how they're doing it as such. So there'd be lots of other things you could consider, and there'd be different scholars. So I guess in my memory approach, I've put forward, I think, 21 factors. And sort of try to look at individually, like how could each one have some implications and stuff like that. But that's the gist of it. I apologize that my book is so expensive. I guess it's just the standard price of every book in that series. But
academic books in general are just
you're able to get it from the library or something. You can you're welcome to have a critical review and say there's problems with it, and I'm sure there is in some ways, but hopefully it just sort of advances discussion and says like, if we use a memory approach in general, what are some of the implications that could be said about Jesus' resurrection? And in general, I argue that there are some things that could cause some reason for questioning, but on the whole, it should actually fill Christians with confidence and say that like there are good reasons to think that this is the reason that Paul and the early Christians remember it this way is because that's what really happened. And it's not just the kind of memory then that may have decayed and had all these problems. It's something that could almost be said to be like unforgettable. It would be just alive and burning in their memories of what sort of happened. And we see in things like the place of the book of Acts that they go about talking about it like all the time and stuff like that. And I think that reflects what would happen if that sort of thing really happened. And it would fill us in confidence then that this is not just something 20 years later they wrote down. This is something that they're talking about all the time. And that, studies show that, if you repeat things and that's a great way of remembering it. And,
So would you mind putting the book back up on the screen? I'm gonna put you full screen so that people can see it. Yeah, so resurrection, remembered, a memory approach to Jesus' resurrection in 1 Corinthians. Yeah, so if you guys want to pick this one up, you can look for it in the description of the video, or you can just search for it on Google, and it'll pop up. And it is a bit expensive, as you say. How much is it at right now on the...
Yep, I can't actually remember, sorry, in US dollars, but it's 273 Australian dollars, which is probably roughly 160 US. Yeah, which is not cheap. Off the top of my head, it's probably the 25th. Is it? Oh, is it 26th already? You are?
It's the 26th. Yeah, 26th where we are.
Yeah. Yeah. So it actually, I think it's just come out today.
Wow, this is exciting though, and yeah, no, I appreciate you coming on to discuss this. I did want to ask as we close out, what is on the future horizon of your work? Are you going to be focusing more on memory and the resurrection, or are you going to be transitioning to a different research project?
Yeah, so I did do my master's thesis, which please avoid, wasn't great, but on Jesus' resurrection. And I basically just asked, say, how do people in Western culture generally view it? Yep. And then, how could you dialogue and respond with them? But yeah, this is to say that, I've been interested in Jesus' resurrection for a long time. I guess that's at least in 2012. And right now, I'm still, I could almost embarrassingly say, William Lane Craig is one of the people who's influenced me. And I think he said when he did his PhD on Jesus' resurrection, he read through every available piece of work on Jesus' resurrection. And so that was my kind of aim as well. I was hoping to do it. But I do have a roughly 100-page bibliography. I apologize that it's so long as such. But I actually have a personal about 200-page bibliography, and so I only got through about half the stuff. And then there's a scholar named Michael Alter who has a 600-page book, and it's nothing but a bibliography of works on Jesus' resurrection. And so pretty much there realized that this was impossible. But to say the topic still really interests me. I feel like I've almost just starting to scratch the surface on the amount of stuff out there. So I only looked at memory of Jesus' resurrection, 1 Corinthians, and I guess that journal article then considers other options. I think someone needs to look at what memory means for the Gospels and other texts. Someone might be into it, but otherwise I'm planning to slowly sort of work through these things as well.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, David, it's great to have you here. I'm really glad that I saw your book pop up on my Facebook feed. And then I realized that we were Facebook friends for a while. So that was cool. Sometimes I don't even remember just hitting the accept button on friend requests. But no, I'm glad that your book came across my feed and that we were able to do this. And thanks for taking the time.
Yep, saying thanks for having me on, and I want to say, so I guess I reached out to you, Friendship Wise. I've loved your work and your videos, and I've benefited from the scholars and stuff you've had on like that. So it's been a blessing to me, and it's a blessing to the larger community. So thanks for all that you do as well.
All right. Thank you, David. Thanks for coming on. And thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. We've got one coming out this Thursday. So, it's going to be really, really cool. I've got Father Vincent Lampert, the exorcist, coming back on to talk about how exorcisms and the resurrection of Jesus actually interact. It's going to be super fascinating. So, all right, I'll see you guys in the next video. See you guys soon. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. You just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?